For almost a year, Skybound has been building up to the launch of an ongoing G.I. Joe title with 4 miniseries, each one centered on and named after a specific character: Duke, Cobra Commander, Scarlett, and Destro. Most of this video will focus on the Scarlett and Destro minis, but I'm going to talk about Duke, Cobra Commander, and even Transformers and Void Rivals a bit, because there has been a great deal of world building done prior to the lead up to the first issue of G.I. Joe that situates the upcoming title in a unique way relative to the other main titles in the Energon Universe. But we'll talk about that more later on. For now, let's turn to the already published titles at hand. The Duke and Cobra Commander series are almost reflections of each other in some ways. For example, the protagonists of both books set off on a mostly solo odyssey in the pursuit of Cybertronian technology, but amusingly enough, the trajectories are pretty much the inverse of each other, where Duke is branded a traitor, acting on his own before eventually being brought back into the fold of the US military, while Cobra Commander is dispatched with the backing of cobra-la, only to later be cut loose and left to his own devices. Much like Duke and Cobra Commander, there are some structural and thematic similarities between Scarlett and Destro as well. Shifting allegiances, deceit, and subterfuge reign supreme in these two series, as both protagonists find themselves forging alliances with questionable bedfellows in the name of some greater goal. By the end, despite their desires to the contrary, both have accepted that their alliances must continue. In the case of Scarlett, she remains with the Arashikage to keep working on her long-term goal of extracting Jinx from her undercover position within their ranks, as well as backing up Jinx in her personal mission to attempt to steer the Arashikage towards being a potential ally and preventing the clan and, by extension, the soul of the Arashikage, which appears to be an Energon sword, from falling under the influence of the wrong people. Cobra, in other words. Jinx cryptically hints at how they'll need allies for what's coming, and that could just be Cobra, but I can't help but wonder what other forces Jinx and the Arashikage might be aware of. I suppose time will tell. While there may be a question of what Jinx is preparing for, there are no such doubts after reading the Destro series. Laird Destro makes peace not only with his place in the Cobra Alliance, but extensive enterprises as well, showing Xamot and Tomax mercy in the name of pooling their considerable resources together to combat forces that are beyond anything known on Earth, referring to Starscream, as well as the artificial intelligence known as Overkill. And similar to how Scarlett and Jinx remain undercover by the end of the Scarlett series, Destro is keeping plenty of his own secrets from his allies, suggesting that he will continue to secretly work towards fulfilling his own aims. And there is a significant secret that Destro is keeping, namely that he has an arrangement not only with Cobra, but with the United States government as well. Specifically, none other than General Flag, the original commander of G.I. Joe in the Marvel comic. This is quite the shocking revelation, but one that is very on brand for a character like Destro. Much like his ancestor who sold arms to all sides of the conflict in the British Civil Wars, we see Destro participating in self-enriching alliances with little regard to principles or ideology. This ancestral connection is firmly driven home with Destro echoing the original Laird Destro's predicament, quite literally in his interactions with Flag, with identical panel composition and very similar dialogue. Then, later, we see Destro assuming the place of Cromwell's soldier from the flashback, reenacting the doling out of punishment for betrayal, but in this case, that betrayal is Darklon selling out the Destro family business. These are interesting instances of history repeating itself for Clan Destro, though the present-day Destro is decidedly in a more secure position of power than his ancestor, illustrating how tenacious, patient, but ultimately consistent the Destros are in their quest to plant and entrench their lineage in the world, all to amass as much influence and power as possible. After reading this latest wave of Joe miniseries, I still consider Cobra Commander to be my favorite of the bunch, due to how well crafted of a character the Commander ended up being. I have to admit though, Destro gave him a run for his money in his own series. It's not that I think Duke or Scarlett weren't solid characters, it's just a really well done fictional villain can sometimes be more magnetic than the hero, and that's certainly the case here for me. As far as I'm concerned, Cobra Commander and Destro absolutely stole the show when it came to these miniseries, and I've already talked about why that's the case for Cobra Commander in previous videos, but for Destro, I think it comes down to how Dan Waters wrote the character. The Commander was chilling and unsettling, whereas Destro is just a total boss. Suave, aristocratic, and ruthless. This is a character who is accustomed to having power, influence, and wealth. In other words, Destro knows he's the shit, and he's gonna make sure you know it too. While these are not desirable qualities for someone to have in real life, in fiction, it makes for a villain that you love to hate. Somehow, it's hard not to root for the guy even though he's a total SOB who is actively ruining the world. Waters gives the character some truly great lines as well, like the bit about how Hell couldn't afford his consultation fee, or my personal favorite from issue 2, where he vows to raise extensive enterprises to the ground and salt the earth. Whew. On the other side of the equation, Scarlett is a bit more lighthearted and grounded in terms of her personality, and she possesses a lot of the characteristics and traits you'd expect from a hero in a story like this. Loyalty, a sense of duty and responsibility, good humor, and a propensity for self-sacrifice. She's also a highly skilled spy and combatant who lives up to the legacy of the most iconic woman from the G.I. Joe roster, and Kelly Thompson does a good job at fleshing out Scarlett's personality even during the action sequences by giving us a window into her thoughts and mindset. Not all of the dialogue and humor landed for me with this series, and I think that really boils down to stylistic preferences, but I thought most of it was pretty good, with this section from issue 4 where Scarlett's strategically finding the most opportune moment to confess to Jinx that her houseplants are dead or dying being the highlight. In my opinion, this moment is a real gem that has stuck with me, and it's made more effective due to how well it calls back to a seemingly throwaway part from issue 1. The art across both Scarlett and Destro was, overall, a real treat. I enjoyed Marco Ferrari's work on Scarlett, even if at times I was somewhat baffled by it. His action sequences are interesting, you gotta give him that. Yes, some of those intricate double spreads read as too busy and complicated for my tastes, but I can still appreciate and respect the ideas and ambition behind them. This is one of those things that's unique to comics after all, so you have to give him credit for making an interesting use out of the medium, but I think his more straightforward action sequences in this series are overall stronger and more effective, but maybe that's just me. Even this one from issue 3, which carries over some similar ideas from the larger, more complex pages, still works better for me due to it being simpler and easier to parse. And look, I like some of the more complicated suggestions of movement and choreography, but these more straightforward images are the ones that really stand out, as they show off Ferrari's talent for anatomy, posing, and eye-catching framing. The sequence with Storm Shadow facing off against the Mugen Onami, for example, stretches across multiple pages, using similarly sized panels for each shot, but employing enough variety in perspectives as well as neat little touches like motion lines or swords extending out of the main panel they show up in and crossing into the gutters and other panels to create energetic, flowing action that works well for a comic with a bunch of ninjas in it. On the Destro side of things, I was glad to see Andrei Bressan working on a G.I. Joe book. I've said before that I think he's a good fit for the property, and I stand by that. And while there were plenty of things that I enjoyed, like his large-scale crowd battles, the moodiness of Destro poring over documents in issue 4, or how Bressan generally depicts Mercer like he's a member of STARS from Resident Evil, I have to say I was a little surprised to find that my favorite art from the series was actually in issue number 3, which was the only one not done by Bressan, instead being handled by Cobra Commander artist Andrea Milana. This confrontation between Chameleon and Destro, particularly towards the start of the issue, I found to be extremely strong, pretty much perfectly rendered as far as I'm concerned. Time seems to slow to a crawl in this immersive opening segment, with Destro monologuing as he approaches Chameleon, his measured and calm demeanor combined with the falling snow suggesting one of those wintry country landscapes that is tranquil and quiet. One where you can almost hear a pin drop, a piece that shattered with a loud and resounding gunshot as Chameleon pulls the trigger of her rifle, perfectly captured with an excellent sound effect. The slowed down, decompressed pace allows for a lot of attention and weight to be given to deliberate movements and actions, where we get panels of Chameleon pulling the trigger before her weapon discharges, the bullet flying through the air, Destro falling to the ground across 3 panels, Chameleon looking through her scope to check for movement, before finally making her approach to locate Destro's body. I am a huge fan of this sequence, and although the action picks up in intensity from here, it becomes no less engrossing as the two battle for survival. In fact, this whole sequence is a perfect visual crescendo, from the serenity of the opening panels to the explosive conclusion with the overkill drones. So props to Milana, as this is just fantastic work all around in this issue. Really, really great stuff. As far as where these series end up by their respective conclusions, both Scarlett and Destro confounded my expectations in several ways. In the case of Destro, I truly expected Overkill to wind up being the guiding intelligence that would make the bats viable for combat operations. Given the historical character's association with the androids and how much the script hammered the point of how useless the bats were because they couldn't distinguish between friend and foe. But anyway, part of me wonders if Overkill survived in some form, and him taking charge of the bats might still come to pass. Or maybe Williamson has something more surprising in store for that particular piece of the puzzle. Also, you gotta love the implication here that Cobra Commander might have been manipulating Destro's actions the entire time by apparently making Overkill possible in the first place. The Scarlett series also defied my expectations. I can honestly say that I did not foresee that both Jinx and Scarlett would still be undercover with the Arashikage by the end, but it's overall just a really intriguing setup, with two best friends undercover trying to direct events within the Arashikage clan to set up potential allies, and all the while Storm Shadow is in possession of a powerful Energon sword, which, for my money, is one of the most interesting uses of the Cybertronian substance in this continuity that we've seen so far, and I've got so many questions about where it came from and how it was utilized throughout the history of the Arashikage. They've got me wanting to know more, and there is such a strong foundation here for future stories. Skybound could have easily launched G.I. Joe after the conclusion of the Duke and Cobra Commander series. After all, both titles conclude with the formation of G.I. Joe and Cobra, but Skybound made the curious decision to continue building up momentum rather than get to the main event straight away, releasing 2 more miniseries with Scarlett and Destro. The Destro series reads in many ways as a continuation of the story begun in Duke and Cobra Commander, and based on the information available to us at this time, seems to feed directly into G.I. Joe #1 in regards to plot points and cast. While that through line from Duke, Cobra Commander, and Destro seems to be fairly straightforward, it's not so simple with Scarlett. Sure, Stalker and Cobra Commander make brief cameos, but despite these instances of connective tissue, most of the events and characters of Scarlett feel separate from the other 3 titles, and judging by the covers and solicit info for G.I. Joe issues #1 through 3, none of this stuff appears to flow directly back into the launch of G.I. Joe #1 in November. The point I'm making is that Scarlett, Jinx, Storm Shadow, and the Arashikage seem to have been placed on the back burner for the time being, and I think that's a smart move. Which is not to say I'm not looking forward to seeing how these threads are resolved, because I certainly am. Like I said, I really want to know more about that Energon sword, but this approach leaves something to anticipate for another time further down the road, rather than tying all 4 series together and immediately folding them into the events of G.I. Joe #1. Now watch, I say that now, and Storm Shadow and Scarlett will end up being a part of the first issue, but assuming I'm not way off target here, we may not see the characters of Scarlett for several months. Maybe not even until closer to the end of the first arc, or maybe even the next arc of the G.I. Joe ongoing. And I think that's pretty cool. It's not the only dangling thread, however. There have been a lot of G.I. Joe seeds planted across the Energon universe to date. The Dreadnoks are still out there. More specifically, Zartan is still out there, hinted at during the Cobra Commander series and still awaiting his reveal. Cobra-la is operating in the background, with Pythona and members of the Royal Guard showing up in Void Rivals as their search for Cybertron begins. And there's still the matter of the big stinger from the Energon Universe 2024 special that revealed that Hawk has formed a second team that appears to be more of a secret than Duke's already secret team. There's also a general question of how the Transformers will play into the G.I. Joe series, if at all. We know Energon is of the utmost importance to Cobra Commander, and G.I. Joe was formed to primarily tackle the threat posed by Cybertronians, and Issue 1 even shows the character standing atop a heap of familiar-looking Transformers characters, though so did Destro #1, and that didn't exactly pan out in a tangible way, so I'm taking that with a grain of salt, but nevertheless, I can't help but wonder if this might be a little different. While I think Megatron is likely going to be joining the Transformers title eventually, part of me wonders if he might continue to interact with the G.I. Joe side of the Energon Universe until then, in some way, as that's where he first appeared outside of brief flashbacks. And I can't be the only one who thinks a rematch between Megatron and Globulus is not only possible, but inevitable. But even if the Decepticon leader doesn't connect to the upcoming series in any way, he still helped flesh out the G.I. Joe side of things up to this point. Likewise, Starscream is tangled up with Mars Industries in a way that is, interesting, to say the least. Oh, this is so silly, but I love it so much. And while that thread may not even leave the pages of that title, again, it's world building for the Joe side of things nonetheless. And questions abound with the debris seen in the epilogue of Destro #5 as well. It seems likely that this ties into Transformers #12, but what if these are separate events? And maybe it's just a difference in artistic depiction that's throwing me off, probably. Regardless, I'm very curious to see how this will factor into the first issue. Talking about all this stuff makes it clear that G.I. Joe has a robust presence in the Energon universe, and it was all accomplished without the benefit of an ongoing title. From my perspective, that's an exciting way to roll into the first issue, as there's already a lot to look forward to in addition to surprises and new twists that have yet to be revealed. With Void Rivals and Transformers, we've watched the creators of those series build up those worlds, characters, questions, and lingering threads with each issue of their respective series. But G.I. Joe will have a lot of that stuff already baked in by the time the first issue comes out, putting the series in a unique and interesting position amongst its peers within the Skybound continuity. But that's it from me on this one. Let me know your thoughts on Scarlett, Destro, and all the G.I. Joe world building done so far in this continuity in the comments. I know I, for one, am excited for the first issue of G.I. Joe, and I'd like to hear how everyone else is feeling about it, so let me know. Like, share, subscribe, you know the drill. And lastly, thank you as always for watching this. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.